read a piece this morning, I think in the Washington Post, pointing out that the incoming energy secretary has claimed that there is no link between the increase in wildfires and climate change. I read the always insightful Matt Levine in Bloomberg writing about a judge in Texas who has effectively declared that ESG investing is illegal, or can be pursued by shareholders as being like not upholding fiduciary duty if your investors did that. I mean, we're in for that kind of era, and it's very, very interesting to see from the lens of India, where climate change is not partisan quite in the same way at all. We don't have that issue, which is not to say that India is doing an incredible thing on climate change. There's a much more complex conversation there, but at least the bare contours of the debate, as in many other countries around the world, is
as in most. I mean, we should say, like, there was a time, and we may return to this time, where the United States was in fact the only country that had not signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, and that doesn't mean that every other country that had signed on is amazing and is like, of course not, obviously not, but every other country could at least get its leadership, or at least its leadership had the wherewithal to say, yes, I can sign on to a document acknowledging that this is happening.
A few years ago, I interviewed Navroz Dubash, who is, among other things, an IPCC author, and one of India's foremost experts on climate. And he remembers telling me he told me about working in environmental and climate activism in the early 90s through the 2000s, when it was still quite nascent. And he recounts being deeply frustrated by the fact that practically every effort ran up against the US Congress, and everything had to be designed. My favorite quote of that interview is him trying to tell an American activist that, like, other countries have politics too. We also have to deal with things. We can't just design everything in the world as a way of just getting through the Congress. And at the same time, the power of that body is immense.
Right. I mean, similarly, I remember speaking to a Finnish social scientist who, she was talking about this method of governance that's more compromise-based, and I said, that's lovely, but this only works if you have certain basic understandings within your society. And she said, well, if you don't do this, then you're just going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement every 4 years. And I said, that's exactly what we're going to do. Like, that's yes, that I agree with you that it's bad, but that's our political reality. And then the other element, so we've talked about the explicitly political, we've talked about the sort of financial capital element. There's also the media element, which is that, I was in preparation for this podcast, was reading up and saw that the Fox News angle was, Democrats blame climate change, but Los Angeles had cut its fire department budget. Now, first of all, whether or not they cut their budget or not, or how they increased it, et cetera, was hotly debated was the subject of much debate in the days after the fires. But second of all, like, yes, we should all invest in our fire departments. However, that was not the issue here. Right? The issue here is that the fires were too strong. The winds specifically were too strong to get overhead and extinguish them. Right? Like, it was too much for fire departments to contain. That is not again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have staffed up fire departments. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be properly paid. There was, in LA, there's been much made of the fact that the incarcerated are sent out to fight fires. They're not allowed to be firefighters after they're released from prison. Like, obviously that's egregious. All of that is true. That's also not why the city of LA was on fire. And why people are still, like, nervously watching to see if they're going to have to leave their homes. It is very concerning to me that we have essentially a propaganda arm of the incoming administration that is telling people, ignore it, right? Don't take it seriously. The other thing about this particular crisis that I find so interesting is that, look, part of the reason that it's impossible to, or very, very difficult to get Americans to really care about It's painful to invest in climate change. It means that you're spending money that you could be spending on something else, on changes that you may not see the direct benefit from, and also maybe benefiting somebody who is not you, right? Because who's getting hit first by climate change? Who's getting hit worst by climate change? It's not Americans, right? It's generally speaking people in the global south, people in poorer countries, and within the United States, it's people who have fewer resources. Generally speaking, what is so interesting about this past week is that we can see very clearly that yes, that is true, and also it's not going to save you, right? You know, Beyonce's mom put on Instagram that her bungalow's gone. This is like your daughter can be a billionaire. It doesn't matter. The fire doesn't care. And yet, despite that, we did not see like I think people just assume, well, I'm different. Well, it won't be my house ever somehow.
Well, from afar, it reminds me of the American gun control debate, which is
I was thinking, yes, it the last week I was thinking of, and I apologize if this is, I really don't mean it as a defensive comparison. It's just how the response is similar. I remember thinking after Newtown, which is in 2013, so over a decade now, which is 7-year-olds in Connecticut. And I remember us not really doing much of anything and thinking like, this is it. Because if we won't do it for little 7-year-olds in a Tony town in Connecticut, we're not going to do it. We're like, what could it possibly take? If LA isn't enough, what is it going to be? If LA isn't enough to get Fox News to say, oh, actually, maybe we have a problem, and the incoming energy secretary to say, maybe this is something that I'll take really seriously during my time in office.
I mean, again, at the risk of not being insensitive with the comparison, I think it goes a bit further there, where people are, and maybe to some extent validly, open to engaging with the approach towards specific disaster management. So maybe there is much to criticize California in how it handled this particular disaster and specifics of firefighting and so on. Just as people might critique how a school, was prepared for shootings and so on, in the very specifics of layouts and policies, while using that debate to ignore the larger picture of why these things are happening in the first place.